In this video we'll be going over extra tools you might need to make your electronics work easier. These aren't really in any particular order, but as always the video has chapters if you want to skip around. To start off, you'll need somewhere to put your soldering iron. Most irons or stations will come with a holder, but if it doesn't, you can get cheap ones basically everywhere. You'll also need something to clean the tip. This can either be a brass sponge or a wet sponge. What you use is up to you. Personally, I prefer the brass sponge. It's always ready and no need to keep it damp. Just a note, although the brass sponges look like something you can just pick up from your local shop, you must make sure they aren't preloaded with soap. This also applies to normal sponges. Soap can cause problems. Unless you're like BigClive.com and can manage a whole production line on your hands alone, you'll probably need extra help holding things. Helping hands are an item everyone should have, even if you don't do electronics. These things come in very handy. A little trick with these so they don't damage what you're working on and hold on a little bit better is to shrink some heat shrink over the alligator jaws. One thing to be careful of is if you're soldering wire and holding it with these, too much heat will cause the PVC coating on the wire to soften and the jaws will bite into the wire even with heat shrink on the jaws. Another useful tool is a PCB holder. Helping hands can hold a PCB, but there's a chance you could damage the track, so these PCB holders are really useful. They don't always work if the boards are really small or have something too close to the edge, but that's pretty rare on properly made boards. You can get PCB assembly frames as well, which come with foam to hold the components in, but those are quite expensive and depending on where you live could be very difficult to get. You could probably build your own assembly frame. Shouldn't be too hard, but I haven't tried as of the time of this video. Flush cutters or some other kind of cutters are a must. You'll need to trim component legs, cut wire, heat shrink, cable ties, whatever. You need cutters, but you don't want to buy really expensive ones because sooner or later you'll cut a component leg which will be hard and it'll dent the blade. Cheap ones off eBay, Amazon, Banggood, or from local stores will do the job. If you're doing any kind of electronic work, sooner or later you'll have to strip wire. You can strip it with flush cutters or a blade, but it's much easier using wire strippers. You have two types of wire strippers, manual or automatic. Manual ones are usually the cheapest. Automatic are normally more expensive but much easier for consistent lengths. They come in heaps of different styles. If you're going to get automatic ones, have a look at reviews and spend a little bit more on them. Good quality ones should last decades, if not a lifetime. Heat shrink is another useful thing to have around. You'll eventually have to protect some kind of joint on a wire. You can get it cheap off eBay, Amazon, Banggood or local stores. Try to get a pack with at least black and red in multiple sizes. I know I said this in the Flux video, but make sure you have extra flux. You'll need it no matter what. I talked about this in the Flux video in detail, but I'll say it again here. You may want to get a Fume extractor for the flux smoke, seeing it can cause respiratory irritation or damage. Just like stripping wire, sooner or later you'll have to desolder something. You have three ways of desoldering: solder wick, solder sucker and a desoldering gun. I'd recommend having at least the solder wick, but the solder sucker is also useful. Solder wick is a braided copper string that's coated in flux. It's easy enough to use. You put it on whatever you want to desolder, put your iron on the wick and let the braid wick the solder away. It's pretty inexpensive and works well. One area the wick can fail a little bit is with plated through holes. Unless you have a small blob of solder over the hole, it may or may not wick the solder out of the hole. My experience has been a little hit and miss with this. You'll also have to be careful you don't keep the iron and the wick on the board for too long, or the heat could cause the pad to be lifted, especially at lead-free temperatures. Another thing, you'll probably need to apply some flux to the wick. Although it does come with flux on it, even brand new stuff doesn't wick very well without extra flux in my experience. A solder sucker is also a very good tool for removing solder. It's a spring-loaded pump. You push the plunger down, put the iron on the joint, put the pump as close to the joint and the iron as you can without it touching the iron, then press the release button on the pump, which releases a spring and it sucks the solder up. These work very well, but if you get one, make sure it has replaceable tips or a high temp plastic tip. These can be pricey considering how simple they are, especially some of the ones with replaceable tips. The downside to these is they can clog up if you desolder a lot, because as it sucks the solder into the pump body, the solder cools quickly and can get stuck in the tip. They can be disassembled to clean out, which you have to do every so often anyway, but they can also be a hassle getting back together again. Most people won't need one of these unless you're doing a lot of desoldering on a regular basis, but your final option is a desoldering gun. It's a soldering iron with a hollow tip and a vacuum. You stick the tip over the component leg, let the solder melt, then pull the trigger, which activates the vacuum and sucks the solder up. These are pretty expensive, especially the station ones. They do make it much easier and quicker, but they can very easily suck pads right off the board if you're too forceful with them. This is something you really can't do without, especially if you're building stuff from scratch or just building kits. The main things you'll probably be testing are voltage, current and continuity, but multimeters have a lot of other functions. You don't have to go out and buy the most expensive Flux meter. A cheap $15 to $20 meter will be perfectly fine. Chances are you'll probably blow up your first couple anyway. I did. Most multimeters have replaceable fuses, so unless you do something really stupid like me, you can normally replace the fuses and it'll be good again. I wouldn't say this is an absolute must, but they can be very useful. You can easily build one from an old computer power supply, and it's normally something you'll end up doing in an electronics course anyway. It's a good way to learn. If you're lazy like me, you can always buy something like a Raiden RD6006, cheap little power interface thing. It still needs to be powered, but it's a decent little unit. This isn't totally necessary, but if you want to protect your desk, then having some kind of mat to solder on is useful. Anti-static ones are very useful for more sensitive components, but not totally needed. You can get cheap silicone mats off of eBay, Amazon, etc., or proper natural rubber anti-static ones with a ground snap on them, although these can be pretty expensive. Lead forming and IC leg forming tools can also be useful if you're doing a lot of components with the same spacing. The lead forming one is mostly for round components like resistors, diodes, etc. The IC leg forming tool is for straightening legs on IC packages for board or socket placement. Both can be bought cheaply or 3D printed. I think that's enough tools to start with. In the next and final video, I'll show you how to solder.